Hello, beautiful. In this video, we're going to focus on hip lift with pivots. See you inside. Our hip lift. In classical pose, you're going to bring your foot up, but because we're going to pivot, I'm going to make you go more sideways. So it's not really in classical, it's going to be out to the side and bring the hip up. So you're going to, because you're putting a little bit more pressure, usually in classical pose we have maybe 10-20% on the ball and then the 80% here. But because we're going to start pivoting, you're probably going to have like almost 60%, because you will, well, no, actually more than that, probably like 90%, because you're going to put some weight so you could pivot that foot. Don't worry, let me explain it better. What's going to happen is that I'll show you. This is how you're going to pivot. Okay, so you notice that hip lift, and then your one foot stays here and pivots. So your right foot is in the middle. I'm going to start with the working hip, which is going to be your left, and your right foot is just going to pivot quarterly, basically. So what's happening is that you're going to put the weight on the ball of your foot, and as you're doing that, that foot, so if you're going to the left, is going to pivot to the left wall. And then this is going to initiate, you're going to go here, facing the back wall. At the same time, you do a little hip lift, and then this is going to pivot to the back wall, and then step, pivot, or ball, pivot. Just do that. Ball, pivot, ball, pivot, ball, pivot, ball, pivot. And so when I pivot on the heel and I bring my toes up, and then I bring it down. Let's do the right. So now left foot is going to pivot. It stays in the center. So you want to go to the back wall, pivot. So now the foot's facing your right wall. Now you'll be back to me. So let's go quarter turn, pivot the foot. Quarter turn, pivot the foot. Quarter turn, pivot the foot. All right, let's add the hip lift. Hip lift. Okay, now pivot the foot. You're still putting weight, so when you're putting weight on the ball of your foot, lift that hip, pivot. Lift, 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 and switch. This is the right side. Lift, pivot. Lift, pivot. Lift, pivot. Lift, pivot. Lift, switch. Repeat. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. So usually that's about the speed you're going to do. Now let's add the arms. So really your arms are kind of in your classical pose, and you're just going to keep here. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. Lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot, switch. And that is your pivot hip lift. Have fun with this. Practice with music.